Drukavik, Kelpie, Fae Folk. Europe is ripe with mythical creatures and dark folklore. Creeping out children with cautionary tales before bedtime is their expertise. But these are more than just myths. You see, many people of Europe have seen these creatures on their homeland. Strange and horrifying creatures that will have you begging for your sanity. These are 10 strange creatures seen in Europe. If you want your story narrated, share it with us at darkstories.org. There's something wrong with my dog. From SwedishHunter. I'm 18 years old and I'm from Kiruna, Sweden. It's about as far north as you can get, and I've lived here since I was 6. My family is originally from Finland, but we moved to my granddad's house here when he passed away. Even if I haven't lived here my whole life, I know our land like the back of my hand, and there's a lot of it. We inherited miles of forest, and my brother and I have turned basically every rock we could find. My dad's an experienced hunter, and he lives in a small cabin in the woods during hunting season. We rarely see him until that's over. Well, when I was around 14, I was finally allowed to come with him. It took a lot of convincing since he sees his hunting as relaxing, so he prefers to be alone. But I'd gotten pretty good at hunting myself, so I was finally allowed to come along. It was autumn, so it wasn't that cold, but I remember we spent the nights huddled together in front of an open fire. We had a really nice time for about a week, fishing and tracking animals in the woods. We had brought along our 1-year-old Norwegian elk hound named Titi, and it was her first hunting trip. We were both excited to see just how well she'd do. One misty morning when we let her go, she took off like a rocket, tracking something around the house a few times before bolting into the forest. We followed her for a few hours, eventually ending up in a very gorgeous clearing, where we sat down to drink some hot chocolate. As we were chatting about nothing in particular, we hear her barking again, which meant she'd found something. So my dad told me to pack up as he ran ahead. I wasn't worried as I saw him disappear into the tree line. I knew the forest better than anyone, I thought. I was walking out towards the tree line after packing up, pulling at some loose strings from my sleeve as a shot rang out, which made me jump. Luckily, my dad had reminded me to wear my earmuffs. I got excited. I practically ran towards the sound, but remembered that my dad had told me to stay away if he started to shoot. So I stopped and I stayed in my place for a while, until I heard another one ring out, and then another. There was a total of 5 shots fired until TT stopped barking and let out a loud scream. It was like nothing I'd heard before. I'd stepped on her tail before once, and I heard her whimper, but the sound she let out that day, it sounded like a strangled cry from a person. I knew something was wrong. I began to scream immediately for my dad. I could hear the sounds of footsteps approaching. Then my dad came running through the forest carrying TT in his arms. He had covered her in his jacket, which was covered in red. I barely remember what happened after, because I was crying so hard. We ended up in Dad's truck and drove off to the vet. They took her in as my dad drove me home, hugging me as I continued to cry the entire day. TT did not get to come home until a few days later, and when she did, she had bandages all over her face. She was really sad and whimpered if anyone got near her snout. I didn't care though. I was so relieved, so happy to have our dog back home and okay. My dad told me she had been kicked by a moose and that her nose was basically crushed. It was bent 90 degrees to her right, and she'd lost most of her teeth, poor girl. I still feel bad thinking about Dad having to feed her through a tube as she healed up. She eventually did get better, and life went on again as normal. She recovered nicely, and I was allowed to come along on more trips to the forest. But now, starting about a month ago, strange things began happening, and it's scaring my whole family. On our last trip, we found tracks that looked like they came from a giant moose. Now we're used to moose walking around our property, and we know how big they can get, but these tracks were so huge that even my dad didn't follow them. He said they were twice as big as the biggest tracks he'd ever seen, and that was saying something. During the night, we'd hear moose calls really close to the house, and we'd find tracks closer and closer to our home. One day, my brother had been playing outside with his friends when they suddenly started screaming. Outside, just by the edge of the forest, stood a massive moose. Dad grabbed his rifle and pointed it towards it, but the creature just stood there, staring us down without even flinching. It only moved when my dad fired at it, and even then it slowly turned back into the forest and walked away like it had all the time in the world. TT ran after it suddenly, which was obviously dangerous as the moose was colossal and didn't even seem a bit scared of any of us, let alone her. We tried to call her back, but she did not listen and ran into the forest. We looked for her, tried to call her back for hours, but we did not find her for 2 days. She ended up coming back home on her own. But honestly, I don't think it's the same dog that ran off. Not only does she seem skinnier after just 2 days, but she acts differently. Even after her severe injuries, TT was always cuddly, obedient. But now she stays alone and keeps to herself. She doesn't even sleep in my bed anymore, which she would do every night. Nowadays, she just wanders all around all night and sniffs around our bedroom doors. Sometimes we hear her growl and make this gargling sound, like she's going to puke. But when we check on her, she's just fine. She doesn't listen to our commands anymore, even when we bribe her with ham or meat. Ham used to be her favorite too. My parents tried to get me not to worry, saying that she's probably just exhausted from being lost and that we need to give her more time. Well, I did. We all did. But she kept acting weirder and stranger. She stopped eating her food altogether. She began to limp, but after bringing her to vets, they never found anything that would cause her to limp. No reason for her to walk strangely. And then her fur began falling out. She grew scabs all over her body. She'd snarl whenever anyone tried to touch her, and we were scared of even going close to her as she'd snap at us. A few days ago, after having a few drinks with some friends, I came home and fell asleep. I had the most horrifying dream. I dreamt that I was in our forest, trying to find my way back home, but I became more and more lost. I knew that I knew my way home, but it was like the ground kept changing around me. I could hear the sound of large hooves stomping around as I began to panic. Then I heard TT bark in the distance, and then heard her scream, just like the day when she was attacked. Then I suddenly found myself in my parents' bedroom, standing in the doorway as they slept in their bed. Then TT crawled out from under the bed, but her front legs were hairy human arms with long fingers that scratched at the floor as she emerged. She looked disturbing. Her teeth dug into her lower jaw and her eyes were glowing bright red. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't do anything. Just watch as she crawled onto their bed. Then she stood up on hind legs, which grew in length. She slowly became an old man with wrinkly gray skin, with eyes that glowed red. He or it turned to me, opening its mouth, which was just a large black hole with long, sharp teeth. It began to growl at me, but it sounded like a dog's growl, just off-key. It's hard to describe. It was kind of like auto-tune, but really, really off-key. It was then that I woke up screaming, my sheets drenched in sweat. But the worst part? TT was standing in the doorway. She was watching me, sniffing the air as I screamed for my mother. I cried in her arms for an hour before she managed to calm me down. She reminded me that it was just a weird dream, and that helped me calm down a bit. But TT kept getting worse, and I'm having nightmares like that every night. In the most recent one, I see TT's body heaving on the ground as her twisted snout bled into her throat, choking her. And every time I have one of these nightmares, I wake up to see TT standing in the doorway. It's like she's watching me and enjoying these nightmares I have. Or maybe she's what's giving me these nightmares. By now we've taken TT to several different vets, including one 6 hours away. They tried to treat her for parasites, bacteria, and a bunch of other things, but nothing makes her better. If anyone knows what this is, what's going on with my dog, I'd like to know. I think that giant moose thing has something to do with it. I think it was the thing that attacked my dog, and I think it came back for her. The Maidenhead Monster from King Vulture. I've seen something you would not believe. I live in England, and this all started when I was coming home from school. I always come and go to school on a minibus, listening to music. One day, as I was looking out the window, passing the time, we weren't far from the school, when I saw something disturbing. There was a creature or thing in a weird walking pose. It was staring right at me. I only saw it for a few seconds, but I could tell right away that it wasn't human, even if it appeared to be pretending to be one. It had no neck, almost as if its head was fused to its body. It didn't have fingers either, none that I could see anyway. It had legs, but the legs were like a deer or elk's. I remember doing a double take, my mouth dropping open, and wishing I could go back to see it. But it was gone in seconds as the minibus drove away, quickly rounding a corner, causing the thing to vanish from my sight. I wasn't so much scared as I was just confused, you know? I saw something that didn't really make sense. A few days later, I saw the same thing again, but it was crossing the road only like 10 or 12 meters away from the car I was in. I had the window open, and I could hear the sickening noise it made. It was constantly screaming like a person in pain. It was a very menacing sound, one that sent chills all over my body. This time, I was happy I was driving away. When I got home that day, I swear I saw something dash past our house, but maybe I was just paranoid. It could have been one of those mean cats that kept attacking our cat. When I went to bed that night, I woke up to the sound of faint screaming again, at exactly midnight. It was the exact same scream, too, that thing had made. I was too terrified to look out the window. When my mother and I have to go get my big sister from work at night, I always get the feeling that I'll see it again, that it's just watching me from the darkness. But at least I haven't seen that thing since. Who knows if it's still out there? If you live in Britain, do your best to avoid the Maidenhead monster. Who knows what it's capable of? Vampire Encounter from Anonymous. I live in the UK in Newcastle, near the countryside, so usually it's quite peaceful and nice. But this experience would change the way I saw this place forever. My experience happened back in August 11th of 2016 at around 10:30 p.m. My brother, my friend, and I were out walking in a field. We went into the woods to sit and walk around, just chatting and hanging out. Around then, we heard a twig snap. We looked and saw a woman just walking through the woods as well. I thought nothing of it. We often saw other people out here walking around. Now, this woman looked quite young, appearing to be in her early 20s. Again, we just ignored her. But soon we realized that the woman just kept walking back and forth. So my friend, worried about her mental state, went over to ask her if she was okay. The woman said to him that she was just keeping an eye on us. We thought this was weird, so we just kept going, but she continued to follow us. We stopped, and this time I went over to tell her to get the hell away from us. This was a mistake, because when the woman lifted up her head and looked at me, there was now blood dripping from her mouth. Her eyes were dark red and bloodshot. When she stared at me, I felt paralyzed. I couldn't move no matter how hard I tried. I regained control of myself only after my friend yanked me by the hand and turned me around. We all began to run. I could see my brother far ahead of us, almost out of the woods at this point, but I couldn't see the woman. I kept getting this feeling that she was right behind us, though. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I couldn't believe what I had seen. I believed in the supernatural. I've always enjoyed folk tales and stories about it, but I never thought once that I'd see something like this. I thought she was going to get us. I thought we were going to die. We had nothing to defend ourselves with, so we ran as far and as fast as we were able to, until we all nearly dropped, out of breath and exhausted. When I looked around, there was no sign of the woman, so we quietly but quickly walked out of the woods. We went back to my house, sneaking past my mother, because I knew she wouldn't believe this story. Be careful in the woods of Newcastle, because I think a vampire lives out there. 3 Fairy Encounters from North Wales, Part 1, from L. Wilco 77. I've always believed in the Fae, and I'd like to share with you 3 fairy experiences that have happened to me while I spent 6 months in North Wales on a study exchange. The first experience happened in March of 2018 at the Great Orme Mines in the town of Llandudno. The Great Orme was a late Neolithic copper mine, and as I was studying archaeology, our lecturer took my class there for a field trip. We went out of season, so there were no other tourists, and one of the resident archaeologists gave us a tour through the underground complex. It's amazing. You can still see the marks where people excavated the shafts using deer antler picks. Inside the mine, there is one of the largest pre-industrial age man-made caverns in the world. While our guide was talking about the cavern, another student and I were standing further up the mine shaft towards an opening in the cavern. Now, we were told not to go off the path because it can be quite dangerous. Rocks can fall, and there are hidden shafts. But the guy I was standing with asked me whether or not the guide would let us have a look in the larger cavern. I said it couldn't hurt to ask, but probably not because of the rules. He said that he was just going to have a little peek inside the cavern. I told him to be careful then. Just as I said this, he began to step inside the cavern when a huge, heavy rock came crashing down from the ceiling, right where he was going to walk. We both jumped back and looked at each other. The commotion had attracted the attention of the rest of the group, and the guide asked what had happened. I told him that the rock nearly came down on our heads, but it didn't look like a rock slide, as only one came down. The guide laughed at us and simply said, "The knockers were telling you two not to go in there." I've heard of mind fairies before, but I wanted to pick his brain, so I asked if he had any experiences with them. He said sometimes when you're exploring the mine, your tools and food will go missing, even when you're alone, then show up in another place. On other occasions, uncanny archaeology discoveries will be found in odd locations where nothing would be expected, like a clay lantern that was used to light the tunnels for the miners 4,000 years ago, being found in exactly the spot it had been left, soot from the flames still blackening the wall behind it. Part 2. The second encounter happened not 2 weeks after the Great Orm mine encounter. I was camping in the thick mountain pine forests around the village of Betvis y Cod with 2 friends. We were staying in a small clay hut in a little gully, not too far from a place called Fairy Falls, where it's said that water fairies dwell. It was early morning at around 6 a.m. My friends were still asleep in the hut, and I had decided to go for a walk in the woods. Out of nowhere, I heard these bugle horns, the kind of horn that horse-mounted hunting parties use. I'll mention here that the forest around the hut was extremely thick, and the terrain was quite steep, so it would be impossible for horses to go through it. There was a small track further up the mountain, but we were so remote that not many people came out this way. It seemed odd that a hunting party would be in this kind of terrain that is so ill-suited for horses and had low visibility for spotting prey. Also, these days, fox hunting is almost entirely illegal in the UK, unless on a private estate, and we were in a national forest. After I heard these horns, suddenly a large white dog with red ears bounded out of the pines, jumped the fence, and ran over to me. It was definitely a hound, similar to a foxhound, but not quite the same. It was friendly though, and came up for a sniff before quickly leaving me to sniff around the clearing the hut was in, looking for the scent of its quarry. Then I caught sight of more white dogs, all with red ears, running through the forest undergrowth, all barking as they had now caught the scent of their prey. I didn't fully see their quarry, but I caught a flash of something white, even more white than the dogs, as it ran down the steep gully edge. It was gone too quickly for me to make out what it was, but it almost looked like it was floating. I could hear the horns getting closer and closer, but I never saw the hunters, only those strange-looking hounds. The thing is, white dogs with red ears have a very specific place in Welsh folklore. They are the Gwyn Onwyn, or hounds of the other world, and they belong to the king of the fairies, Gwyn ap Nudd. They are also said to escort the dead to the other world, as well as hunt wrongdoers to the ground. Were they actually the Gwyn ap Nudd's hounds? I can't say. I didn't see Gwyn himself, but it was certainly an odd and eerie scene, so far out in a thick forest. Part 3. This final fairy encounter happened on the night of Belcana, Eve of May Day. Belcana is an ancient festival heralding in the first day of spring. Many Wiccans and pagans celebrate it today, but the festival is much older than any New Age rendition of it. It is meant to be one of the days of the year. The other day is Samhain or Halloween, when the veil between our world and the other world is at its weakest. I was at a stone circle in the town of Bangor, on the straits that separated mainland Wales from the island of Anglesey, the last stronghold of the Druids. We had decided to have a little Belcana party, so we were playing some music and drinking a heap of wine. Before we got into the wine, though, I poured a little onto the earth as an offering to the Fae. I'm not a Wiccan or really a pagan, but I thought it'd be fun to do. Anyways, the sun set and it grew dark. I was looking out onto the bare trees near the edge of the stone circle and noticed little flickering lights in the tree canopy. At first, I thought they were car headlights across the straits, but they didn't move like car lights. They bobbed up and down, and when I looked directly at them, they vanished. Because they were in the canopy, I thought they could have been the lights of a helicopter, but it was silent, no telltale sound of the rotors. Now I will say that I had been drinking some wine, but I definitely wasn't drunk. I wasn't sure of what I was seeing though, so I asked my friends if they had seen them too. None of them had. I kept pointing them out and insisting that they were there, but no one saw them, not even the self-described witch of the group. Because no one but me seemed to see them, I let it go and watched them until they simply faded away. This to me was undeniably a Fae experience. I saw them. I wasn't drunk or high. I just wish someone else had seen them too. This time though, I had no particular idea of which Fae it may have been. I've had plenty of other paranormal and unexplainable experiences in my 6 months in Wales. I'll share them one day, as they are quite strange. I'll say that even though I've experienced these things in my life, I have never had so much activity happen in such a short space of time as when I came back to my ancestral homeland. Mythical creature in an abandoned village. From Mikarlo 01. I'm a 20-year-old guy from Croatia. I think I was 12 or 13 though when this happened. We were kids full of adventure spirit. One day we were told by my friend Martin's mom that there was an abandoned church somewhere in the forest around my town. She used to play there when she was young. So me, Martin, and another friend of mine named Luca accepted the challenge to go find and explore the church. Now, my town is located in the rural part of our country, and it's surrounded on 3 sides by a forest and 1 side with a meadow. There's also an abandoned village there called Deratina, and that is where we 3 went. It's not entirely abandoned, but I think only 3 people live there in 3 separate houses. So Deratina is surrounded by forest on all sides, and it's connected with gravel roads. We came in ready to investigate. We came to one point where the road was too rough to ride bikes on, so Martin and Luca went to check further on foot, while I stayed to guard their bikes. I wasn't scared because there was no legend of anything scary in this town or around it, and I'd never really heard any weird stories from out here. But not much longer after they left, I began to hear these loud screams. At first they sounded like dogs that were being attacked, and I was beginning to get nervous. I didn't know what to do in that kind of situation. I remember thinking, maybe these dogs were attacking my friends. I wanted to grab a nearby brick and go help them. The moment I'd gathered the courage to actually do something, I saw the 2 of them running back now, yelling at me to run. We escaped, and when we thought we were safe, I asked them about what was going on. They seemed pretty shocked by something. They asked me if I had heard those screaming sounds, and I said yes, that I thought it was dogs, but they said they weren't dogs at all. Lucas said that it sounded like it was coming from an abandoned house in the woods. Martin said that it felt like something didn't want us to find the church. They said that something had been chasing them out of those woods, but they never got a good look at it. We quickly rode home on our bikes. The next day, Martin came to me, talking about a legend he had researched recently, called the Drakovic, or Howler. The legend says it is a creature made from an unborn baby that can't be destroyed or killed until he finds his own peace, and the descriptions of its howl matched perfectly with the sound we heard that day, like canid howls mixed with child's cries. We would never return to that abandoned village again. The Fireplace. From Green Pansy 67. When I was a child, I used to live in an old Victorian house in the UK. My bedroom had a huge fireplace like you would see in a living room, but because it was Victorian, they used to have them in the master bedrooms as well. I would share this room with my big sister, who was about 10, and I was 8 at the time of the incident. We used to sleep in this huge room on a bunk bed opposite the fireplace, about 6 feet away from our bed. We were used to hearing noises from it, often from the pigeons that nestled in the chimney, as it hadn't been used for years. We would occasionally see twigs and other nesting material fall from the chimney. It wasn't something that bothered us too much. We basically grew up with it. On the other hand, I was always afraid of the dark. It would keep me awake for hours before bed, as I always felt like I was never alone there. Of course, at the age of 8, I knew very little about the paranormal, and I used to assume it would be monsters that would get me in my sleep. One night, I'd been lying in bed for a while, unable to sleep. I could hear my sister snoring gently above me on the top bunk, although that wasn't what was bothering me. I was facing the wall away from the fireplace when I suddenly felt an enormous surge of terror. The kind you hear about when you listen to ghost stories, but of course at that age I just knew the feeling was wrong. So I pulled the covers over my head tightly, leaving my feet poking out at the bottom. I lay there for what seemed like only a few minutes, holding my breath and trying to be as still as a dormouse. I could hear breathing right next to my face though, from the other side of the blanket, and it made me want to scream. But I couldn't. I was too terrified. All of a sudden, I felt something sit on the bed next to me. It wasn't too heavy, but it sure as hell was heavier than me. I sat as still as I could, trying not to cry from fear. As I lay there still as could be, the thing, whatever it was, grasped onto my big toe and pulled on it. In my fright, I yanked the covers off. I was face to face with a huge black figure. The closest thing I could relate it to would be the Grim Reaper without a scythe. The creature wore a cloak with a sort of pointed hood on its head, and although it was hard to tell, I knew it was no human. As soon as it saw me, it floated out from my bottom bunk, and without as much as a whisper, it faded into the chimney and was gone. I was so horrified that I jumped out of bed and climbed up into my sister's top bunk. I didn't move a muscle all night. In the morning, I asked my sister if she had seen anything. My sister said she hadn't, and so I asked my mother what she thought it was. She was actually quite believing of my story, saying that ever since they had moved in, she had often seen out of the corner of her eye a presence moving from the back door to the pantry in a straight line. Needless to say, I've never forgotten that thing in my bed, and now I never sleep with my feet hanging out of the covers anymore, as it creeps me out just to think about it. Well, I couldn't find another 2 new stories in time to complete this video, but I do have 2 juicy stories that match today's theme from back in 2017, so odds are you haven't heard these before. Enjoy. Welsh Woods Monster, submitted by Nathan. I live in South Wales in a little village just outside of Cardiff. I don't want to name the place specifically, but there is a very popular singer from this particular town. Also, anybody who knows Wales will know that the outside cities can be quite rural and a mixture of fields, forests, and mountains that quickly will merge into old mining villages. One day, I was on my way home from an 11-hour shift. As this happened in winter, it had been dark for hours, despite only being 8 o'clock in the evening. I had decided to take a detour, as my regular route was blocked due to an accident, and it was the worst decision I've ever made. I decided to go over the mountain that leads to my local village. The road goes up a steep incline that cuts in on itself, and it continues to go up and up. There are no streetlights, but there are road markings that keep you on track. After about 10 minutes, I make it to the top of this mountain. There is nothing notably strange at this point until I start to drive the slow incline down towards the deep forest. I'm about 30 seconds into the drive down when I realize there are no other sounds other than the rattling of my engine and the radio. It was strange. Even though I couldn't hear anything outside of the car, It felt like I was being told that something isn't right. I don't know why, but I stopped the car in order to listen to the sounds that should be there. The trees were dark and still, and I could barely see past the tree line either side of me. In front of me, my car headlights brightened up the road ahead. I turned off my engine as I found it difficult to concentrate on the sounds outside of the car with the engine running. And then it was silent. There wasn't a sound, no crickets, noises, or birds flapping their wings. There was not even the sound of the wind blowing. It was like all sound in that moment was non-existent, and it filled me with dread. And then I heard it. "Help!" Someone cried through the darkness of the forest. "Help me!" But this voice was distorted, like if someone played it on a record player. It sounded crackly but faded out towards the end of every cry for help. It was so wrong. I jumped out of the car and I tried to focus on what I could see past the trees. My heart was racing. I started to sweat, and I was breathing so heavily I felt my heart was coming up through my mouth, and I was frozen with blind fear. And then I saw it. It was a man, or so I thought. They were disproportionate, with long, skinny legs and arms, and I saw bright red eyes appear and disappear as if it was blinking and looking straight at me. It seemed to walk or glide towards me with his arms swinging back and forth. I don't know because my head was fuzzy at the time. I felt confused and afraid. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. As it got closer, I could see its face, and this thing was the furthest from human. It had little notable facial features. This creature stopped, and it opened its mouth wide and wider than anything I'd ever seen before, and it let out the most terrifying scream I'd ever heard. It was so loud that it felt like it dug into my very existence and shook me to the core. That was the moment I shook my head and I realized what was going on. Instantly, I jumped into the car and tried to start the engine. My hand was shaking so much, I could barely turn the key. After what seemed like a lifetime, I managed to put the car into first gear, and I drove off. I drive down the road and check my mirror, and that thing is standing in the road, not moving, not making a sound, just standing there. When I got home, I locked all the doors, and I cried for hours until I finally fell asleep. Eventually, someone introduced me to scary horror stories, and I ended up doing my own research. I stumbled upon tales about skinwalkers, and that's what I believe I saw. Whales or not, it could have only been that. I've had nightmares ever since, and I've always thought that one day I will see that thing again. Needless to say, I have not gone near that area ever since. Scratches Outside, submitted by Hanika P. I've been living in Cornwall for just over 5 years now. I've learned and heard of loads of different spirits and monsters in Cornish folklore. Well, I have unfortunately had a few experiences and actually have stories to tell. About 4 years ago, I learned about the beast of Bodmin. It is supposedly a large black wild cat who lives on the moors of Bodmin. It's been said to have killed masses of livestock in the early 1900s and has turned its attention to people every once in a while. I've always been interested in cryptozoology, so this kind of thing really grabbed my attention, and that's how I began doing my own research. After quite some time, I kind of got bored by the idea when the sighting of this creature began to dry up, so I lost interest in it for a while. Well, that was until I went on a camping trip with my family and some friends. I spent a couple of nights in an open field near the home of these family friends. It was very fun, and we were all having a good time. We just relaxed and shared a few stories by the campfire, having drinks. That is, until one of my friends, let's call him Charlie, started telling us about how some of the trees in the neighboring woods had large scratches up them, up to 6 feet up the trunks. We all threw theories back and forth, and that's when Charlie brought up the beast of Bodmin. Being the scaredy cat I am, I decided to go off to bed and ignore the conversation taking place outside my tent. The night was thankfully uneventful, and we woke up early for a hike on the moors. We had been given time to look around standing stones and some other landmarks. Then Charlie took me and my family to a small set of woods. After about 10 minutes of walking, we came to a group of trees, most of which had what I thought was claw marks. I knew what he was trying to show us, but both me and my younger brother, let's call him Ali, didn't want to stay around for too long. I'll be honest, I was scared. So after much pushing, my mom, me, and Ali left, and we started walking back towards camp. The thought of having a huge man-eating beast practically next door to our camp gave me chills, and it made me feel physically sick, nervous. I wanted to just go home. I didn't feel safe out there. On the last day of our camping trip, Ali and I decided we would stay together in the same tent. We were still really scared and did not want to sleep alone. We both lay there and were fast asleep in only a few minutes. My brother was only 8 or 9 at the time, but I felt a lot more comfortable knowing I had someone by my side. But this temporary feeling of security quickly left. At about 2 in the morning, I woke up and needed to use the bathroom, so I made my way slowly out of the tent, trying my best to not wake up Ali, and I did my business. To my surprise, I saw the glare of eyes in the torchlight. Now I was half asleep, and I thought it was my dog Bella, so I called her over. But immediately after, I heard this low grumble, and instantly I shut up and reassessed the situation. I realized after a moment I was looking at a large black shape, not a small white dog. I did not wait around trying to find out what it was going to do. I ran and jumped into the open tent and right onto my sleeping brother. I quickly zipped up the tent and grabbed hold of a now really angry and sleepy-eyed Ali. He later told me that he had been trying to push me away, tried to ask me what was going on, but I guess I wasn't really listening. I spent about half an hour listening out there for the noise again, but thank God it never happened. Ali eventually fell back to sleep, but I knew I wouldn't be able to, not until I was back home and safe. I'd never been so happy as to see the sun rise the next day and to hear my parents waking up. Even still, I could not get the image of this massive black shadow in the woods, a shadow that was twice my size at least. Beast of Bodmin or not, there was some sort of monster in the woods, something that nearly had me cornered in the middle of the night. Anyway, the next day, needless to say, I did not tell anyone. Knowing my family, I knew that if they hadn't seen what I'd seen, then they would not believe me. I didn't even believe me, and I still don't sometimes. Or maybe that's the denial. We got home and I tossed away any thoughts of the camping trip, trying not to remember the creature I saw in the woods. I didn't think I'd ever have to remember or think about that trip again until 3 nights after our return home. Because I was sitting in bed watching TV, having hot chocolate, when I first heard it. The pat, pat, pat sound of something running back and forth in front of my house. It came again and again, night after night, no matter how much I tried to ignore it. So I observed the sound, and I realized it did not sound anything like a dog or a badger, not even a fox. All of these animals have non-retractable claws, which means I would have heard the sound of claws scraping against the road. But I didn't, and it was far too big to have just been a cat. It was very heavy, the padding sound of paws brushing away stones and dirt. When I gathered the courage to look outside, I was struck by the familiar shape. Out on the road was that same silhouette I had seen, a dark figure whose fur blended in with the night, a feline form that was far too big to be any house cat. It was stalking along the road, yellow eyes beaming under the moonlight. Immediately, I stepped away from the window, fear enveloping me. I could hear the sounds continue as I walked away, and they continued for several nights after that. But after a few weeks, it just stopped. I still have no idea what it was to this day, nor will I claim it to be anything, but I know what I heard,
and I know what I saw. There is some sort of creature out there, something larger than the natural wildlife, something that looks predatory and dangerous. I'll be sure to keep these events in mind when and if I ever go camping again. And I really hope if anyone comes to Cornwall and goes camping here, that you take my experiences to heart. Just be careful out there.
Europe is a vast and diverse continent. Each border comes with such a drastic change in cultures at times. You step away from one nation of rich mythology to step into another that is so much different and often just as terrifying. Needless to say, if you want to live in a place where there's always a new monster to be scared of, Europe is the place to go. Good night. If you enjoyed this episode of Darkness Prevails, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. If you have a story of your own you want narrated, start by sending it to us at darkstories.org. If you want to support the show, there's a link to my Patreon in the description, along with a link to my merchandise. Now, as usual, here are my 5 favorite early comments from the previous episode about 5 scary bus stop stories. Gato Dogcat says, "No, I don't want to wait for my bus in the morning. I used to do that every day for like 5 years, and it was always cold no matter the time of year. I hated it." Levi Hart Music says, "Your darkness has brought light into my world. Keep it coming." Crazy how darkness does that, and I'm very grateful that it does. Fireshard2 Vlog says, "Notice me, darkness, I'm lonely." Well, I'm replying just because you have a really cool profile picture. Very Wendigo-esque. The RJL25 says, "I'm glad I got my driver's license. Yay, now you get to pay for gas for the rest of your life." And Kojo3 Official says, "If there was a horror convention, tickets for your show would be sold out fast. Love your stuff." I was actually requested to attend a horror convention once. I got a paid weekend to go as well, me and my wife. But due to anxiety, I didn't attend. I wasn't really ready to open up a booth or anything. So maybe one day. Well, that brings us to the end of this Darkness Prevails episode. But don't you worry, more scary stories are on the way soon. So stay tuned. Until next time, here are the credits to my amazing patrons who continue to donate. They're great people. Remember, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.